Picture this. A 15-year-old girl, draped in silk and jewels, trembling as footsteps approach her chamber door. Her wedding night has arrived. But instead of love, instead of tenderness, what awaits her is something so horrifying that her body surrenders to terror in the most humiliating way imaginable. She soils herself, right there on sheets that will be inspected by dozens of witnesses come morning. This isn't fiction. This is the documented wedding night of Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, and it's just one thread in a tapestry of matrimonial horror that history has desperately tried to forget. What if I told you that for centuries, the most intimate moment of a woman's life was orchestrated like a public execution? That virgin. Brides were stripped naked by strangers, inspected like livestock, and forced to bleed on command while crowds waited outside their bedchamber doors. That some wedding nights ended not in consummation, but in death itself. Tonight, we tear away the veil that historians have draped over these savage rituals. We expose the blood-soaked sheets, the screaming brides, the drunken grooms who couldn't perform, and the witnesses who watched it all happen. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a warning about what happens when power, politics, and human flesh collide in the most intimate space imaginable. The marriage bit. But here's what they never taught you in school. Here's the secret that makes scholars uncomfortable. Even today, these weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic, calculated, a machinery of humiliation that operated for over 1,000 years across every royal court in Europe and beyond. And the most disturbing part? Everyone knew. Everyone participated. Everyone pretended it was normal. From the torch-lit chambers of medieval France, where priests blessed beds while virgins wept, to the frozen halls of Russia where Catherine the Great waited hours for a husband who preferred toy soldiers to her flesh. From the scarlet-draped rooms of China's Forbidden City, where emperors fled in panic, to the darkened chambers of Sparta, where brides were dressed as boys and left alone in darkness, waiting for men they'd never met to claim them like spoils of war. These stories have been sanitized, romanticized, turned into fairy tales where princes rescue princesses and everyone lives happily ever after. But we know better, don't we? We know that behind every royal wedding portrait, behind every recorded alliance between kingdoms, there's a young woman's terror that no one wanted to document. Until now. The year is 1819. Madrid. The Spanish court buzzes with anticipation as Ferdinand VII, already twice widowed, prepares to take his third bride. Maria Josefa, Amalia, arrives from Saxony like a lamb dressed for slaughter. 15 years old. Raised in a convent. She's never even seen a man undress, let alone understood what marriage truly means. The court whispers about Ferdinand's peculiarities, his violent temper, his strange obsessions, his previous wives who died under mysterious circumstances. But no one warns the girl. No one prepares her for what she's about to face. The wedding ceremony proceeds as planned. Gold and crimson everywhere. Incense so thick it chokes the lungs. Maria Josefa can barely breathe beneath her veil, but that's nothing compared to what's coming. As night falls, the real ceremony begins. The one they don't paint portraits of. The bedding ceremony. And this is where our story takes its first dark turn, because in 19th century Spain, a royal wedding night isn't private. It's witnessed. It's verified. It's inspected. Ladies in waiting undress the terrified girl, while she pleads in German, a language none of them speak. Or perhaps they do speak it. Perhaps they simply choose not to understand. They strip her down to nothing, place her in a bed that feels more like an altar, and then they wait. Outside the door, Ferdinand approaches. But he's drunk, furiously drunk. And when he enters the chamber and sees his bride for the first time without her wedding dress, something snaps. She runs. Can you imagine? A naked 15-year-old girl, running through the royal chambers while her new husband, the King of Spain, chases her like a hunter pursuing prey. She's screaming in German, he's roaring in Spanish, and the entire court pretends not to hear. When he finally corners her, when there's nowhere left to run, that's when it happens. Her body, pushed beyond the limits of terror, releases everything. The smell fills the room. The king recoils in disgust. And somewhere in the palace, scribes are already drafting the official version of events that the events will never mention what really happened in that room. But Maria Josefa's humiliation is just the beginning of our descent into matrimonial hell. Because, while she survived her wedding night, others weren't so fortunate. Let me tell you about Attila the Hun, the scourge of God himself, who conquered half of Europe, but couldn't survive his own wedding night. The year is 453 AD. Attila takes a new bride, a Germanic beauty named Ildiko. The wedding feast is legendary. Wine flows like blood, and blood, as you'll discover, flows like wine. Attila retires to the bedchamber with his young bride. By morning, he's dead. No wounds. No poison detected. Just blood pouring from his nose while his bride sits beside his corpse, trembling and unable to speak. Did she kill him? Was it divine justice? Or was it something else entirely? Something connected to the ancient tradition of virgin sacrifice that predates written history. The Romans had a phrase, in vino veritas, in wine, truth. But on wedding nights throughout history, in wine there was often death. And Attila's mysterious demise opens a door to an even darker corridor of history. One where wedding nights weren't just about consummation, but about blood ritual. You see, blood has always been the currency of wedding nights, but not in the way you might think. The tradition of displaying blood-stained sheets didn't begin as proof of virginity. That's the lie they tell you. The truth is much older, much darker. In ancient cultures, that blood was an offering, a sacrifice to ensure fertility, to appease spirits, to seal pacts that went beyond mere marriage. And when Christianity swept through Europe, it didn't eliminate these practices. It absorbed them, transformed them, made them respectable. Consider the bedding ceremonies of medieval Europe. Picture the scene. A 14-year-old noble girl, married to a 40-year-old duke she met 3 hours ago. The Archbishop of Reims stands at the foot of the bed, blessing the union while the couple lies beneath sheets, fully naked, surrounded by witnesses from both families. The Archbishop reads scripture, while the Duke attempts to perform his marital duty. Can you imagine the humiliation? The performance? Anxiety? The sheer impossibility of intimacy under such conditions? But wait, it gets worse. Because after the act, or the attempt at the act, the witnesses don't leave. They wait. They watch. They inspect. The sheets must be examined for blood. If there's no blood, the bride is not a virgin. If there's no evidence of consummation, the marriage can be annulled. Political alliances crumble. Kingdoms fall. All because of what happens, or doesn't happen, in those first terrible hours after the wedding feast. And this is where we must talk about Catherine the Great and Peter III of Russia. The year is 1745. Young Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, soon to be Catherine, arrives at the Russian court like a ray of sunshine. Beautiful, intelligent, charming. Everyone loves her. Everyone except the one person whose opinion matters, her husband-to-be, Peter. On their wedding night, Catherine waits in the marriage bed for hours, perfumed, prepared, ready to do her duty for Russia. When Peter finally arrives, he's carrying something. Not flowers, not wine, toy soldiers. He climbs into bed with his new wife and proceeds to play with his miniature armies on the sheets between them. This goes on for hours, days, years. 7 years to be exact. 7 years of a marriage that was never consummated. 7 years of humiliation for Catherine, who would later claim that she went to her husband's bed over 100 times, and each time he either passed out drunk or played with his toys until dawn. The entire Russian court knew. They whispered. They laughed. They placed bets on whether the empire would ever have an heir. But here's the part that historians don't like to discuss. Catherine eventually did have children. Several of them didn't, while still married to Peter. And Peter, despite his apparent lack of interest in his wife, never questioned their parentage. Why? Because in the theater of royal marriage, sometimes the performance matters more than the truth. But if you think Peter's toy soldiers were strange, wait until you hear about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France. Their wedding night in 1770 has become legendary for all the wrong reasons. The ceremony was magnificent. Versailles glittered like heaven itself. The 16-year-old Austrian princess and the 15-year-old French Dauphin looked like angels painted by Botticelli. But when the archbishop blessed their marriage bed and the witnesses finally withdrew, nothing happened. Not that night. Not the next night. Not for 7 years. The official story was that Louis suffered from phimosis, a medical condition that made arousal painful. But recently discovered letters tell a different tale. Louis simply didn't know what to do. No one had explained the mechanics of sex to him. He thought sleeping beside his wife was enough to create children. It took a visit from Marie Antoinette's brother, Emperor Joseph II of Austria, who gave Louis what might have been history's most important sex education lesson to finally consummate the marriage. 7 years. Can you imagine the pressure? The humiliation? The entire French court, watching, waiting, gossiping about what wasn't happening in the royal bedchamber. But these are still the stories of all survivors. The ones who live to tell the tale, or at least have it told for them. There are other stories. Darker stories. Stories of wedding nights that ended in blood for all the wrong reasons. Let me tell you about the tradition they called chivaré, or charivari, a custom that spread from medieval France to the American frontier, where wedding nights became a form of community-sanctioned torture. Picture this: newlyweds, exhausted from their wedding celebration, finally alone in their winter bedroom scene. Suddenly, the night explodes with noise. Gunshots. Screaming. Pots and pans beaten like war drums. The door splinters open, and dozens of neighbors pour in, drunk and shouting. They drag the couple from their bed, sometimes naked, and parade them through the streets. In some communities, they threw the groom in the river. In others, they locked the bride in a barn with the pigs. And this wasn't considered assault. This was tradition. This was how communities welcomed new couples into married life. The violence of chivalry was psychological warfare disguised as celebration. It ensured that no couple could consummate their marriage in peace. It turned the most intimate moment into a public spectacle. And sometimes, too drunk or too cruel, it ended in tragedy. There are documented cases of grooms who drowned during these celebrations, of brides who never recovered from the trauma, of wedding nights that became crime scenes. But perhaps no wedding tradition was more systematically cruel than what happened in ancient Sparta. And I need you to understand, when I say cruel, I mean it in ways that will make your blood run cold. Spartan brides were captured. Not symbolically. Actually, captured. Abducted from their families and taken to a dark room where their heads were shaved like condemned prisoners. They were dressed in men's clothing and left alone in pitch darkness. Then their new husbands, whom they'd likely never met, would sneak in like thieves, remove their belts, and take them by force. This wasn't romance. This was conditioning. The Spartans believed that marriage should begin with violence to establish dominance. The bride's shaved head and men's clothing were meant to ease the transition for young warriors who had spent their entire lives in the company of other men. Some historians argue this was necessary, because many Spartan men were more comfortable with male companionship than female intimacy. The darkness ensured that the bride couldn't see her attacker's face clearly, making every subsequent encounter a reminder of that first violent night. The psychological damage was intentional, calculated. It created wives who feared their husbands and husbands who saw their wives as conquered territory. But wait, I haven't told you about the witnesses yet. Oh yes, even in Sparta, there were witnesses. Not in the room, close enough to hear. Close enough to know if the deed was done. Because, in warrior culture, a man who couldn't conquer his bride was no warrior at all. The screams of Spartan brides on their wedding nights were considered proof of their husband's virility. The louder the screams, the greater the warrior. Can you imagine being that young? Woman, knowing that your pain was being celebrated as someone else's strength. And this brings us to the Victorian era, where you might think things would have become more civilized. You would be wrong. Dead wrong. The Victorians transformed the wedding night into a medical procedure. Let me paint you a picture of a typical middle-class Victorian wedding night. The bride, who has never received any sex education whatsoever, is delivered to her marriage bed by her mother, who whispers one piece of advice: lie still and think of England. The groom, equally ignorant but expected to know what to do, fumbles in the darkness because looking at his wife's naked body would be improper. But here's where it becomes truly horrific. The next morning, the sheets must be inspected. Not by family members this time, but by medical professionals. Doctors who would examine the bride to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. These examinations were invasive, humiliating, and often more traumatic than the wedding night itself. There are recorded cases of Victorian brides who were subjected to multiple examinations because the first doctor wasn't satisfied with the evidence. And the evidence had to be blood. Always blood. But here's what the Victorians didn't understand, or chose not to understand. Not every woman bleeds during her first sexual experience. Modern medicine tells us that only about half of women experience bleeding during first intercourse. But in Victorian England, no blood meant no virginity. No virginity meant shame, scandal, potentially annulment. So what did desperate families do? They faked it. Chicken blood, pinpricks, even small vials of blood hidden in the marriage bed. The deception was so common that there were secret industries built around providing virginity insurance to nervous brides. But the Victorians added another layer of horror to the wedding night: medical intervention. Doctors prescribed treatments for wedding night. Hysteria, which was basically any emotional response from the bride other than silent compliance. These treatments included laudanum, essentially liquid opium, administered before the wedding night to ensure the bride remained docile. Some doctors recommended chloroform. Others prescribed mechanical devices designed to prepare the bride for her wifely duties. I'll spare you the details, but know that these devices were nothing short of torture instruments dressed up as medical tools. Let me tell you about one particular case that exemplifies the Victorian horror. Lady Florence Dixie, married in 1875, later wrote in her private journals about her wedding night. Her husband, drunk on brandy and aroused by pornographic photographs he'd purchased specifically for the occasion, attempted to recreate what he'd seen in those images. When Florence resisted, he called in a doctor who diagnosed her with matrimonial hysteria and administered enough laudanum to render her nearly unconscious. What happened next, she could never fully remember, but the blood on the sheets the next morning told its own story. And society considered this normal, acceptable, proper. Now, let's travel to China's Forbidden City in 1922, where the last emperor, Pui, faced his own wedding night disaster. But this one has a twist that reveals just how deeply political power infected even the most intimate moments. Pui, only 16 years old, had chosen his bride from photographs. He'd never met Gobulo Wanrong in person. The wedding was spectacular, a last gasp of imperial grandeur in a China that had already moved on from emperors. But when the time came for the wedding night, tradition demanded that it take place in the palace of earthly tranquility, where every Chinese emperor for 600 years had consummated their marriages. The chamber was painted entirely in red, the color of luck, fertility, and in Chinese culture, sexuality itself. Red walls, red ceiling, red bed, red sheets. Even the candles burned red. For a 16-year-old boy who had been raised in near isolation, surrounded only by eunuchs who had been castrated to serve the imperial family, Puyi took one look at the room, one look at his bride, and fled. He ran through the forbidden city like a child fleeing a monster, leaving Wan Ron alone, confused and humiliated. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. The entire court was waiting for confirmation of consummation. Without it, the marriage wasn't legitimate. Without legitimacy, Puyi's already tenuous claim to the throne crumbled even further. Advisors tried to convince him to return. Eunuchs whispered instructions through the door. But Puyi never went back. Not that night. Not ever. The marriage was never consummated, and both Puyi and Wan Rong lived their entire lives in separate parts of the palace, prisoners of a tradition that neither of them wanted to uphold. And this brings us to the darkest corner of our journey through matrimonial horror. The corner where wedding nights weren't just about violence or humiliation, but about death itself. Not accidental death. Not death by misadventure. Murder. Calculated, cold-blooded murder. Disguised as tradition. You see, in certain royal courts, when political alliances shifted, when new powers rose, the wedding night became the perfect cover for assassination. Consider the case of Lucrezia Borgia, whose name has become synonymous with poison and betrayal. But the truth about her wedding nights, yes, plural, is far more horrifying than the myths suggest. Lucrezia was married 3 times, each marriage a political move orchestrated by her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, Cesare Borgia. But here's what the history books gloss over. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, didn't die in battle or from illness. He was strangled in his bed, in the same bed where Lucrezia had lain with him just hours before. The killers? Sent by her own brother, who had decided that Alfonso was no longer politically useful. Imagine being Lucrezia, waking up next to your husband's corpse, knowing that your own family had orchestrated his death, and being expected to mourn publicly while privately preparing for your next political marriage. But even this pales compared to what happened to some brides who weren't lucky enough to survive their wedding nights. In certain Eastern European kingdoms, there was a tradition called the rite of the first night, where local lords claimed the right to bed a bride before her husband. But sometimes, these lords took more than just virginity. They took lives. There are documented cases from medieval Hungary and Romania, where brides were found dead in the morning, their wedding nights having become murder scenes. The official stories always blamed mysterious illnesses or weak constitution, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Young, healthy women, dying on the one night when they were most vulnerable, most isolated from their families, most under the control of men they didn't know. These weren't random tragedies. This was systematic elimination of women who knew too much, who posed threats to power structures, or who simply had the misfortune of being desired by the wrong men. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of all these horror stories is not the violence, not the humiliation, not even the death. It's the silence. The conspiracy of silence that surrounded these wedding nights for centuries. Every lady-in-waiting who dressed a terrified bride, every courtier who heard the screams, every servant who changed blood-soaked sheets, they all knew. They all participated in maintaining the facade that these were joyous occasions. They wrote letters describing beautiful ceremonies while ignoring the tears. They painted portraits of happy couples while knowing the truth of what happened behind closed doors. This silence was not accidental, it was enforced. Women who spoke out about their wedding night, traumas faced consequences ranging from social ostracism to imprisonment in convents to mysterious disappearances. Men who showed too much gentleness to their brides were mocked as weak, unmanly, unfit to rule. The system perpetuated itself through fear, through shame, through the crushing weight of tradition that no individual could challenge without risking everything. And now we come to the most disturbing revelation of all. These traditions, these horrors, they didn't end with the medieval period. They didn't disappear with the Victorians. Elements of them persist even today in cultures around the world where virginity testing is still practiced, where blood-stained sheets are still displayed, where young women are still delivered to marriage beds they didn't choose to men they've never met. The horror of the historical wedding night isn't just history. It's a warning about what happens when we value tradition over humanity, when we prioritize bloodlines over blood, when we turn the most intimate human connection into a public spectacle of power. But there's one more story I need to tell you. One more wedding night that encapsulates all the horror, all the tragedy, all of the systematic cruelty we've explored tonight. It's the story of Princess Caroline of Brunswick and the future King George IV of England. The year is 1795. George, the Prince of Wales, is deeply in debt and desperately needs Parliament to pay his bills. The price? Marriage to his cousin Caroline, whom he has never met. When they finally meet, 3 days before the wedding, George takes one look at her, turns to his aide, and says, "I am not well. Bring me a glass of brandy." The wedding ceremony itself is a disaster. George is so drunk he has to be held up by 2 dukes. He cries throughout the ceremony, staring not at his bride but at his mistress, who sits in the congregation. When the archbishop asks if anyone objects to the marriage, the mistress sobs audibly. But the ceremony continues. It has to. Politics demands it. That night, George is so intoxicated he collapses in the fireplace grate. Caroline leaves him there and goes to bed alone. But sometime during the night or early morning, duty calls. The marriage must be consummated. The line of succession must be secured. What happens next is described in Caroline's letters as the vilest experience of my life. George, still drunk, still reeking of brandy and vomit, performs his marital duty with all the romance of a medical procedure. 9 months later, their daughter Charlotte is born, proving that the deed was done. But George never shares a bed with Caroline again. He declares publicly that once was enough, that he has done his duty to England, and that he would rather die than touch his wife again. Caroline, for her part, goes on to live a separate life, taking lovers, causing scandals, becoming one of the most controversial figures in British history. But she never forgets that wedding night. In her final letters, written as she lay dying, she describes it as the night her soul was murdered. The night she learned that in the arithmetic of royal marriage, a woman's body was worth less than a man's debt. And this, ultimately, is what all these stories have been building toward. The recognition that for centuries, the wedding night was not about love, not about union, not even really about sex. It was about power. It was about ownership. It was about the transformation of human beings into political currency. Every blood-stained sheet was a receipt. Every witness was an auditor. Every scream was a signature on a contract written in flesh and fear. The traditions we've explored tonight, from the bedding ceremonies of medieval Europe to the chivalries of the American frontier, from the violent captures of Spartan brides to the medical horrors of Victorian marriage beds, they all serve the same purpose: to ensure that marriage was not a private choice, but a public performance. To guarantee that women, especially, understood that their bodies were not their own, but belonged to their husbands, their families, their kingdoms, their empires. But here's the final, most unsettling truth. These stories I've told you tonight, they're not the worst ones. They're just the ones that were documented. For every Maria Josefa Amalia whose humiliation was recorded, there were thousands of nameless women whose suffering went unwitnessed. For every Catherine the Great who survived to tell her tale, there were countless others who didn't. The true horror of the historical wedding night is not in the stories we know, but in the silence of all the stories we'll never hear. And as we sit here in our modern world, comfortable in the belief that we've evolved beyond such barbarism, remember this. Every tradition we accept without question, every ritual we perform because that's how it's always been done, carries within it the potential for horror. The wedding night horrors of history weren't created by monsters. They were created by ordinary people who believed they were upholding tradition, maintaining order, doing what was expected. So, the next time you attend a wedding, when you watch the bride walk down the aisle, when you hear the traditional vows about honor and obey, remember what those words used to mean. Remember the blood, the fear, the brutal humiliation that once accompanied them. Remember Maria Josefa Amalia, 15 years old, soiling herself in terror. Remember Catherine, waiting hours for a husband who preferred toys to her flesh. Remember all the nameless brides who screamed in the darkness while witnesses pretended not to hear. Because forgetting them, forgetting their pain, their humiliation, their sacrifice, that would be the greatest horror of all. These women's wedding nights were stolen from them, transformed into public spectacles of awe, power, and control. The least we can do is remember. The least we can do is bear witness to their witness, and ensure that such horrors remain where they belong, buried in the darkest chapters of our history, never to return. But I'll leave you with one final image, one last glimpse into the abyss of matrimonial horror. Somewhere in a vault in Vienna, there exists a letter written by a Habsburg princess on the morning after her wedding night. The letter is sealed with wax the color of dried blood. It has never been opened. The archivists who catalog it report that sometimes, on quiet nights, they swear they can hear crying coming from inside the vault. Not the crying of ghosts, they insist, but something worse. The crying of secrets that refuse to stay buried. The crying of truths too terrible to tell. What does the letter say? What horror was so unspeakable that even the Habsburg court, notorious for its record-keeping, chose to seal it away forever? We'll never know. But perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps some wedding night horrors should remain in the darkness where they belong. Although I wonder what other letters are hidden in other vaults. What other testimonies of terror are waiting to be discovered? And what will future historians think when they uncover the wedding night horrors that we're creating today? The ones we don't even recognize as horrors because we're too close to see them clearly. If this journey through the darkest corners of matrimonial history has unsettled you, good. It should. History's greatest horrors happen not in extraordinary circumstances, but in ordinary moments when power meets vulnerability, when tradition overrides humanity, when silence becomes complicity. The wedding nights we've explored tonight are mirrors, reflecting not just the past but warnings for the future. Next time, we'll descend even deeper into history's hidden chambers, where we'll uncover the truth about royal nurseries and the infancy who disappeared in the night. Until then, remember, the most dangerous lies are the ones dressed up as tradition. If you dare to continue this journey into history's forbidden corridors, subscribe now. Leave a comment with your own family's dark wedding tradition, the ones whispered about, but never fully explained, and share this with someone who thinks they know history. Because the truth is always darker than the fairy tale. The veil has been lifted. The silence has been broken. The The wedding night horrors of history have been exposed. What you do with this knowledge, that's up to you. But you can never again claim you didn't know. You can never again pretend that the past was simpler, purer, more romantic than the present. Because now you know the truth. Now you know what really happened when the wedding guests went home, when the candles were lit, when the doors were closed, and when marriage meant blood, fear, and brutal humiliation. Sleep well, if you can.